An elderly black man did not anticipate that his life would be shattered unexpectedly. Two aggressive policemen rushed toward him, accusing him of a crime he did not commit. Without a moment's hesitation, they threw him to the ground, handcuffed him, and assaulted him mercilessly. What unfolds next will leave you astonished, as this act of cruelty escalates into an even greater injustice. You won't believe what happens when his son, the chief of police, arrives at the scene. Watch until the end to discover the shocking turn this story takes that you weren't even aware of. Don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support will help us uncover more similar stories. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the serene park where Jonathan Williams, a 72-year-old black man, sat on a weathered wooden bench. The park had always been his refuge, a rare space where he could escape the chaos of the city and the weight of his long life. Jonathan was a man of few words, but his heart was filled with stories. He often sat quietly, reflecting on his past, on the challenges he had faced, and the triumphs he had achieved. He had lived through the civil rights movement, witnessed the world transform, yet he still couldn't shake the feeling that some things remained unchanged. As the cool breeze rustled the leaves above him, Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the sound of the wind to calm his weary mind. He didn't notice the patrol car approaching until it came to a stop near the park entrance. Two officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the park as if searching for a target. Their mission was clear. They were looking for a suspect, a black man who had escaped custody earlier that day. But instead of continuing their search, they spotted Jonathan. "Hey, look at that old man over there," one of the officers, Officer Grayson, muttered to his partner, Officer Miller. "Looks like we've found ourselves a convenient scapegoat." Officer Miller chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, no one's going to care if we take him in. They'll believe whatever we tell them." Without further thought, the two officers strode toward Jonathan. He sensed their approach and opened his eyes, noticing their determined gazes. Confused, Jonathan sat up straighter, wondering why they were coming his way. He had done nothing wrong. He was simply sitting in the park, minding his own business. "Excuse me, sir," Officer Grayson said as they neared. His tone was cold and authoritative. "We need you to stand up." Jonathan frowned. "Is there a problem, officers?" "Stand up," Officer Miller barked, disregarding Jonathan's question. Slowly, Jonathan rose to his feet, feeling his knees ache as he did so. He had no idea what was happening, but he was too old and too tired to create a scene. "I don't understand. What is this about?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "We don't need to explain anything to you," Officer Grayson snapped. Without warning, he grabbed Jonathan's arm and twisted it behind his back. Jonathan winced in pain, his heart racing. "Wait, what are you doing? I haven't done anything." "Quiet," Officer Miller shouted. He shoved Jonathan roughly, causing him to stumble forward. The old man tried to regain his balance, but his legs betrayed him, and he fell hard to the ground, the impact jolting his body. "Get him up!" Grayson ordered, and Miller yanked Jonathan to his feet with little regard for his age or the evident pain he was in. "Please, you're making a mistake," Jonathan gasped, struggling to breathe as they tightened handcuffs around his frail wrists. "I'm just sitting here." But his words fell on deaf ears. The officers had already decided his fate. To them, he was just another black man, another easy target to fill their quota, another name they could check off the list. Officer Grayson smirked as he shoved Jonathan toward the patrol car. "You're coming with us, old man. We know what you've been up to." Jonathan's mind raced as they forced him into the back seat of the car. How could this be happening? He was no criminal. He had lived an honest life, raised a family, and served his community. Yet here he was, treated like a common thug, for no reason other than the color of his skin. As they drove off, Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. He knew he had to stay calm, but the fear and anger swirling inside him were impossible to ignore. He couldn't help but wonder if this was how his life would end, brutalized and humiliated by those who were supposed to protect him. The officers didn't speak much as they drove, their silence a testament to their indifference. Jonathan stared out the window, his hands trembling in his lap. All he could think about was his son, Christopher, who had dedicated his life to law enforcement, rising through the ranks to become the chief of police. If only Christopher knew what was happening. But Jonathan knew that even if his son were here, these officers wouldn't care. To them, Jonathan was just another black man in the wrong place at the wrong time. The thought sent a wave of hopelessness washing over him, but he refused to give in to despair. He would survive this, he told himself. He had to. As the car sped toward the police station, Jonathan tried to steady his breathing, forcing himself to remain calm. But deep down, he couldn't shake the sense that this was only the beginning of a nightmare. Christopher Williams, chief of the local police department, had just finished a long day of meetings and paperwork. He had decided to take a brief walk through the park near the station to clear his mind, the place where his father, Jonathan, often came to relax. Christopher hadn't planned to stay long, just enough time to breathe in the evening air before heading home. As he strolled along the path, he heard raised voices in the distance. His senses heightened, and his instincts as a law enforcement officer kicked in. Christopher's steps quickened as he approached the source of the commotion. The voices grew louder, more aggressive, and he could now see the flashing lights of a police cruiser parked near a bench. His eyes widened in disbelief as he recognized the elderly man being manhandled by two officers. It was his father. For a moment, Christopher stood frozen in shock. The sight of his father being treated like a criminal, the way the officers shoved and yanked him as if he were nothing more than an object, sent a wave of fury through his veins. His father, a kind and honorable man, had never deserved this kind of treatment. Without thinking, Christopher sprinted toward the scene, his badge still clipped to his belt, his heart racing in his chest. "Hey, stop!" Christopher shouted, his voice piercing the air. The two officers turned their heads, eyes narrowing at the approaching figure. One of them, Officer Miller, sneered as he recognized that it was another black man rushing toward them, as if he had any authority here. "Who the hell are you?" Miller demanded, stepping in front of Jonathan as if guarding his catch. Christopher skidded to a halt, pulling out his badge and holding it up for them to see. "I'm Christopher Williams, Chief of Police. That man is my father. Let him go immediately." For a moment, the officers stared at him in stunned silence. Then Grayson, the second officer, snorted in disbelief. "Yeah, right, and I'm the President of the United States." Christopher's eyes blazed with fury as he stepped closer, standing tall. "I'm not joking. I am the Chief of Police, and you're making a serious mistake right now. Let my father go." But instead of complying, Officer Grayson's expression hardened. "Get back now," he barked, moving to block Christopher's path. "Back off," Miller added, grabbing Christopher by the arm roughly. "We don't care who you say you are. You're interfering with police business." Christopher tried to pull his arm free, but the grip only tightened. "You're making a huge mistake. I outrank both of you. Release him now." Officer Miller laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "What? You think just because you're black and wearing a badge we're supposed to believe you? You're nobody. Now shut up before we decide to take you in too." Christopher's patience snapped. "This is not how we conduct ourselves as officers of the law. I'm ordering you to let my father go, or I'll have both of you written up for misconduct." Grayson, already irritated, gave Miller a nod. "Cuff him!" Without warning, Miller shoved Christopher against the side of the patrol car, twisting his arms behind his back with unnecessary force. Christopher grunted in pain as the cuffs clicked around his wrists, the cold metal biting into his skin. He struggled against the restraints, but the officers only tightened them further. "You're under arrest for obstruction," Miller hissed in his ear, "and whatever else we feel like charging you with." Christopher's mind raced, disbelief mixing with rage. How could this be happening? They were arresting him, the chief of police, for trying to protect his own father. The humiliation of the situation weighed on him, but his main concern remained for Jonathan, who was now slumped in the back seat of the cruiser, bruised and beaten. "You're going to regret this," Christopher warned through gritted teeth, but the officers only ignored him as they shoved him into the back of the cruiser beside his father. Inside the car, Christopher looked at his father, who was breathing heavily, his face swollen from the rough treatment. "Dad, I'm so sorry this happened," Christopher whispered, guilt piercing through him. Jonathan shook his head slowly, his voice weak but steady. "It's not your fault, son. This is the world we live in." Christopher's jaw tightened as he heard those words. He had spent his entire career trying to fight against the very injustices that had now come to claim him and his father. He had risen through the ranks believing that being in a position of power would allow him to make a difference. Yet here he was, shackled and powerless to stop the abuse inflicted upon them because of the color of their skin. As the car sped toward the station, Christopher tried to steady his thoughts. He had to stay focused, had to think of a way to get them out of this mess. He knew that once they arrived at the station, his identity would be undeniable, and the officers would face the consequences of their actions. But right now, they were still under the delusion that they held the upper hand, and Christopher knew that they would continue their abuse as long as they believed in their own invulnerability. They would soon learn how wrong they were. The cruiser's engine hummed as it sped through the city streets, carrying both Jonathan and Christopher in the back seat, handcuffed and bruised. The two officers in the front, Officer Miller and Officer Grayson, seemed to revel in their supposed victory. Christopher, the chief of police, sat next to his father, both men now prisoners in the hands of those meant to protect. Officer Grayson glanced in the rearview mirror, his smirk barely contained. "Look at these two," he muttered to Miller, "thinking they can just boss us around. That one really thinks he's the chief of police." "What a joke!" Miller chuckled in agreement. "Yeah, chief of police, my ass. He probably printed that badge online. Just another black guy thinking he's better than us." Christopher's blood boiled, but he forced himself to stay calm. The more they pushed, the more they mocked him, the harder it became to hold back the anger swelling in his chest. He knew he needed to stay composed. Soon enough, they would arrive at the station, and the truth would come out. But for now, they were both trapped in the back of that car, with no one to defend them. As the car sped along, the two officers kept up their insults and taunts. They seemed to take pleasure in humiliating the two men. "So, Chief," Officer Miller sneered, turning halfway in his seat to face the back. "What's it like to sit in the back of a patrol car for once? Must be a real change from sitting in that big cushy office of yours." Christopher met his gaze without flinching. "You're making the biggest mistake of your career, Officer Miller. You and Grayson both." Miller rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed. "Oh, give it a rest. No one's buying your crap. You're just another black guy trying to pull a fast one. You really expect us to believe that a black man could be the chief of police in this town?" Grayson joined in with a low laugh. "Yeah, as if the city would trust one of you to run the department. Not in a million years." Christopher gritted his teeth. The sheer arrogance and racism of these men were staggering, but he wasn't surprised. He had encountered it his entire life, both inside and outside the department. But this time, they were digging their own graves, and they didn't even realize it. Beside him, Jonathan remained quiet, his body tense from the beating he had received. His breath came in shallow gasps, and Christopher could see the exhaustion and pain etched on his father's face. He hated that his father had to endure this, that after all his father had been through in life, he was now being subjected to this cruel treatment in his old age. Officer Grayson tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, his tone mocking. "You know, maybe we should just take our time getting to the station. Give them a little more time to reflect on their mistakes." Miller grinned at the suggestion. "Yeah, or maybe we should just take them for a nice little drive. You know, show them the sights." The two officers exchanged amused glances, their laughter filling the car. Christopher's patience was wearing thin. He had been a police officer for years, and he had seen corruption up close. But this was beyond anything he could have expected. To think that men like Grayson and Miller still operated with such impunity, believing they were untouchable, made him sick to his stomach. But their arrogance would be their downfall. They just didn't know it yet. As they drove, the taunts became more personal, more vile. Miller turned his attention to Jonathan, looking at the old man with pure disdain. "Hey, old man," he called out. "What's it like, huh? What's it like being a washed-up nobody sitting here getting your son arrested too? You must be real proud." Jonathan didn't respond. His silence seemed to annoy Miller even more. "Oh, come on," Miller goaded. "You've got something to say, don't you? Or did we knock the fight out of you already?" Christopher's fist clenched in his lap, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. He could take the insults directed at him, but hearing them go after his father, an elderly man who had done nothing but sit on a park bench, was unbearable. Every second of this ride felt like an eternity, and Christopher could only hope that it would end soon. Finally, the station came into view. The large brick building loomed ahead, and Christopher knew that once they arrived, the truth would come crashing down on these officers. They still had no idea who they were dealing with, but they were about to find out. As they pulled into the parking lot, Grayson parked the cruiser with a flourish, as if he had just completed some grand triumph. He turned to Miller with a wide grin. "Time to book these two. I can't wait to see the looks on their faces when they realize just how deep they're in." Miller snorted. "Yeah, let's see how the chief holds up under the real pressure." They both got out of the car, yanking the doors open and dragging Jonathan and Christopher out roughly. Miller shoved Christopher forward, laughing as he stumbled. "Watch your step, Chief," Miller mocked, giving him another shove for good measure. Christopher caught himself, refusing to let them see any sign of weakness. He walked with his head held high, even as they led him and his father toward the station's entrance. As they approached the door, Christopher shot one last glance at the two officers, his expression deadly serious. "You still have time to stop this," he said quietly, "but if you don't, you'll regret it for the rest of your lives." Miller scoffed, pushing him through the door. "Yeah, right. Keep dreaming, buddy." Christopher didn't respond. He knew that soon the truth would come out, and the tables would turn, and when they did, these men would finally understand the cost of their arrogance. As they entered the station, the usual hum of activity seemed to pause for a moment. Officers moved around in the lobby, but the sight of two black men being dragged in, one of them an elderly man, wasn't anything unusual for them. What no one realized yet was that these two men were no ordinary detainees. Miller and Grayson strutted confidently through the station, still laughing quietly as they shoved Jonathan and Christopher forward. Christopher kept his eyes fixed ahead, his expression unreadable, while Jonathan struggled to maintain his balance. Every step was a reminder of the injustice they had just endured, but Christopher knew this nightmare was about to end. "Hey, look at this pair," one of the other officers at the desk chuckled, not bothering to ask who they were. Grayson smiled and joined the attention. "Yeah, caught these two causing trouble in the park. Couldn't believe the nerve on them. This one," he jabbed a thumb at Christopher, "was claiming he's the chief of police." The officers in the lobby burst out laughing. "Chief of police?" one of them jeered. "That's a good one." "What, did he buy that badge at a costume store?" Miller smirked as he gave Christopher another shove. "Yeah, can you believe the ego on these guys? Can't handle a little authority, so they make up stories." Christopher remained silent, his face calm despite the rising tension he felt inside. He knew it was only a matter of time before the situation flipped on its head. Suddenly, one of the higher-ranking officers at the station, Lieutenant Rodriguez, entered the lobby. He glanced at the two men being escorted in and immediately recognized the figure in the tailored suit. His eyes widened in shock. "Chief Williams!" Rodriguez's voice cut through the laughter like a blade. The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Christopher, and the laughter died instantly. The officers in the lobby stood frozen, the smirks and jokes vanishing as realization began to sink in. Rodriguez quickly stepped forward, his face pale. What's going on here?" Miller, still not understanding the gravity of the situation, crossed his arms defiantly. "This guy? He's no chief. We found him in the park causing trouble, claiming to be the boss, but we know better." Rodriguez's expression shifted from confusion to anger. He turned on Miller and Grayson, his voice shaking with disbelief. "Are you out of your minds? That is Chief Williams. He's your boss." For a brief moment, there was absolute silence in the station. The words hit Miller and Grayson like a freight train. They exchanged quick, panicked glances as the realization of what they had done sank in. Grayson, his face paling, stammered, "Wait, what?" Christopher locked eyes with him. "I told you who I was, and now you're going to face the consequences." Miller's bravado crumbled in an instant. His arrogance melted into sheer terror. "This can't be happening," he whispered, backing away slightly. "This can't be real." Jonathan, still standing beside his son, watched the officers panic with a calm that only a man who had survived years of injustice could possess. He said nothing, but the satisfaction in his eyes was unmistakable. Rodriguez quickly removed the handcuffs from Christopher's wrists, the metal clanging to the floor. "I'm so sorry, Chief. I don't know what they were thinking," he apologized hastily. Christopher rubbed his wrist, the marks from the cuffs still visible. "I warned them," he said quietly, "but they didn't listen." Grayson's legs trembled as he realized the full weight of his actions. "Chief, we didn't know. We didn't realize." "It was just a mistake," Miller added, his voice shaking. "We didn't mean anything by it, sir." Christopher's eyes remained cold. "A mistake? You beat an old man. You humiliated both of us. You mocked me and refused to believe that a black man could be your superior. That's not a mistake. That's who you are." The station's atmosphere had shifted completely. Officers who had been joking mere minutes ago now stood silent, watching the fallout. Miller and Grayson, once so smug, now stood frozen in fear. Their confidence had evaporated, replaced with the sudden realization that their careers and possibly their lives were crumbling before them. Desperate, Miller dropped to his knees, his eyes wide with panic. "Please, Chief, don't do this. I have a family, kids. I was just doing my job, I swear." Grayson, shaking uncontrollably, followed suit, falling to his knees beside Miller. "We're so sorry, Chief. We didn't mean to. Please, we're begging you." Some of the officers in the room exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the display of two grown men reduced to begging for mercy, sobbing as they pleaded for forgiveness. But Christopher's face remained stone cold. "You think mentioning your families is going to change what you did?" Christopher's voice was low, dangerous. "You treated me and my father like we were less than human. You didn't care about us, our lives, or our families. Why should I care about yours now?" Grayson broke down, tears streaming down his face as he groveled at Christopher's feet. "Please, I'm sorry. I swear I'll never do anything like this again." Miller, his voice coarse, added, "We'll do anything, Chief. Just don't end our careers over this. We'll lose everything." Christopher looked down at the two men, his expression unflinching. He had seen their type before. Officers who believed their badges gave them unchecked power. Men who thrived on the suffering of others. They had acted with cruelty and racism, and now they were trying to escape the consequence by appealing to his mercy. But Christopher knew that if he let them off, they would never change. They would just go back to their old ways, terrorizing others without a second thought. Slowly, Christopher shook his head. "No, you need to face the consequences of your actions. I'm not going to forgive what you've done, and neither will this department." Miller sobbed openly, collapsing onto the floor as Grayson buried his face in his hands. The reality of what they had done, what they had lost, sank in fully. Christopher turned to Rodriguez, his voice calm but firm. "Take them to Internal Affairs. I want a full investigation. They're done." Rodriguez nodded sharply. "Yes, Chief." The station was dead silent as Miller and Grayson were escorted away by Lieutenant Rodriguez. Their once confident and arrogant faces were now drained of all color, replaced with the look of men who had just seen their world collapse. The rest of the officers in the station watched in stunned disbelief, the weight of what had just occurred settling over everyone like a heavy fog. Christopher Williams stood tall, watching as the two officers were led toward the Internal Affairs office, their pleading voices now reduced to quiet murmurs of despair. For the first time since the ordeal began, he allowed himself to take a breath, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. His father, Jonathan, still stood beside him, silent and stoic, though Christopher could see the relief in his father's eyes. Rodriguez returned quickly, standing at attention in front of Christopher. "The investigation will begin immediately, Chief. I'll make sure that every detail of what they did is documented, and I'll personally ensure that this doesn't get buried." Christopher nodded, his expression calm but resolute. "Thank you, Rodriguez. This department needs to be cleaned up, and it starts with men like them." Rodriguez hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Chief, I had no idea this was happening. I swear if I had known." Christopher held up a hand, cutting him off. "I know, Lieutenant. I trust that you'll handle this situation with the seriousness it deserves. This isn't just about me or my father. This is about fixing the deep-seated problems in our force. We can't allow officers who abuse their power and act out of prejudice to continue to wear the badge." Rodriguez nodded firmly. "Understood, Chief." With that, Christopher turned back to his father, who had remained quiet through the entire exchange. Jonathan was still shaken from the brutal treatment he had endured, but he managed a small, weary smile as he met his son's gaze. "You handled that well, son," Jonathan said softly, his voice filled with both pride and exhaustion. "You made sure justice was served." Christopher's expression softened as he looked at his father. "I'm sorry, Dad. You never should have gone through this. They had no right to treat you that way. No one does." Jonathan shook his head gently. "It's not the first time I've seen something like this. But I have to admit, I never expected it to happen to me, not at my age." He paused, his voice growing quieter. "But I'm proud of you, Christopher. You didn't let them get away with it. You stood up to them, and you showed them what real leadership looks like." Christopher smiled faintly, though there was a heaviness behind it. "I just did what was right. Men like Miller and Grayson, They are the reason so many people don't trust the police, and as long as I'm in charge, I'm going to make sure that changes." Jonathan placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his grip firm despite his weariness. "You're doing the right thing. Keep fighting, son. Keep standing up for what's right. That's all we can do." Christopher nodded, his heart swelling with pride for the man who had raised him. His father had always been his guiding light, teaching him about integrity, respect, and the importance of standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. Everything he was, everything he had achieved, was because of the values his father had instilled in him. As they stood together, side by side, the rest of the station seemed to come back to life. Officers began moving around again, but now there was a new tension in the air. Whispers circulated about what had just transpired, the gravity of it settling in. Some of the officers were visibly uncomfortable, clearly realizing that the department was about to undergo a serious shakeup. Christopher knew that this incident would send shockwaves through the entire force. Miller and Grayson weren't the only ones who needed to be held accountable. There were other officers who had turned a blind eye to injustice, who had let their own biases cloud their judgment. This was just the beginning. As the day moved on, Christopher and Jonathan prepared to leave the station. Jonathan's bruises were being tended to by a paramedic, and though his body was sore and aching, his spirit seemed lighter. Before they left, Rodriguez approached Christopher one more time. "Chief, Internal Affairs is already starting the investigation. We're also going to issue a public statement about what happened today. The press is going to be all over this soon." Christopher nodded, already expecting the media storm that was about to hit. "Good. The public deserves to know the truth." Rodriguez hesitated, then added, "I also wanted to let you know, a lot of us here, we stand with you. We want this department to be better too. We're ready to make the changes you've been pushing for." Christopher was silent for a moment, then he smiled, a genuine expression of gratitude. "Thank you, Rodriguez. I appreciate that." With that, Christopher and Jonathan finally left the station, walking side by side. The cool evening air greeted them as they stepped outside, the sky now painted with the deep colors of twilight. The ordeal was over, but Christopher knew the fight was far from finished. As they walked down the steps, Jonathan glanced at his son. "What happens next?" Christopher looked out across the city, his jaw set with determination. "Next, we make sure this never happens again. Not to you, not to anyone." Jonathan nodded, a look of pride washing over his face. "You're the right man for the job, son." Christopher didn't reply, but his resolve was clear. He had been given this position of power for a reason, and now more than ever, he understood the responsibility that came with it. He would fight for justice, not just for his father, but for every person who had ever been wronged by those who wore the badge. And as long as he was chief, there would be no place for men like Miller and Grayson in his department. This shocking case of brutality is just one of many, but it reminds us how deeply rooted injustice can be. No one should have to face such cruelty, especially at the hands of those meant to protect us. If this story moved you, make sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss powerful stories like this. And if you want to see more, check out our other videos. Together, we can shed light on these issues and push for change.